In 1984, the first sea otter slipped back into Elkhorn Slough, a tidal estuary on Monterey Bay, so fouled by agricultural runoff that scientists had quietly stopped expecting it to recover. The eelgrass beds that once carpeted the bay floor had retreated to a few dying patches. The creek banks were caving in. What that animal did next, and what the animals that followed did after, would not just restore a dead estuary, but rewrite what scientists thought they knew about how oceans heal, and about who does the healing. To understand what the sea otter walked back into, you have to see what had been done to Elkhorn Slough in its absence. The slough sits at the southern edge of Monterey Bay, bordered on all sides by 2.69 million acres of Salinas Valley farmland. Every rainfall flushed synthetic nitrogen fertilizer off those fields and into the water. Nitrates climbed year on year until monitoring stations at the slough recorded concentrations 2 orders of magnitude above the thresholds set by local water agencies. Thick mats of algae bloomed across the surface, died in the heat, and sank to the floor. Bacteria devoured the dead algae and stripped dissolved oxygen from the water column. What remained was warm, clouded, low in oxygen, and hostile to the animals that had once built their lives around it. On the eelgrass blades that still survived, Zostera marina, the dominant seagrass of the central California coast, a thin coat of epiphytic algae crept across every surface, blocking sunlight until each blade dimmed and curled, and the meadow beneath it retreated another meter toward nothing. But the algae was only half the story. The deeper cause stretched back 2 centuries and began not in the estuary, but on the open ocean, in the holds of Russian and American fur trading ships. Sea otters had ranged continuously along the California coast since long before any record existed of them. Their pre-trade population was estimated at 16,000 animals statewide. The maritime fur trade arriving in the 1700s found a pelt so dense, the thickest fur of any mammal alive, that Chinese luxury markets in Canton paid prices that made the slaughter economically irresistible. By the 1850s, the population had been compressed toward extinction. By 1910, the California sea otter was believed gone entirely, and with them went the only predator capable of keeping the crab populations of Elkhorn Slough in check. Cancer crabs, large, numerous, and no longer afraid, filled the ecological space the otter had held. They ate the small invertebrate grazers that cleaned algae from eelgrass blades. They burrowed into the tidal creek banks and devoured the marsh plant roots, anchoring the sediment from below. Walking the slough edge in those years, a researcher would watch chunks of salt marsh carve off the bank and drop silently into the water, the soil crumbling at the edge like wet clay. Once those sections fell into the channel, they did not return. The slough was eating itself. Managers tried. For decades, the standard approach to ailing estuaries was what ecologists call bottom-up restoration, replanting eelgrass beds by hand, anchoring individual shoots into the sediment with garden staples and bamboo stakes, stabilizing collapsing creek banks with engineered rock structures, and lobbying upstream farms to reduce fertilizer runoff. The work was painstaking, expensive, and cyclically defeated. A peer-reviewed synthesis of 82 eelgrass restoration projects conducted along the United States West Coast between 1989 and 2020 found that between 32 and nearly 60% of all restoration plots had failed by the time each project concluded. The reason was consistent across sites, environmental conditions, specifically nutrient loading and algal bloom cycles, overwhelmed whatever had been planted before it could establish. The nutrient-loading strangling Elkhorn Slough continued climbing even as restoration crews worked season after season. Kirsten Wasson, research coordinator for the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, would eventually state the problem with precision. Most estuarine managers had been focusing only on the bottom of the food web, replanting marsh plants and hoping the ecosystem above would follow. What the slough actually needed was its predator restored before anything planted in it could hold. The top of the chain had been severed. nothing planted at the bottom would stay. The sea otters did not return by program or plan. They returned the way animals do when a coast begins, incrementally, to tolerate them again, slowly, individually, following the smell of crab through an estuary that had not held one of their kind for generations. The first animals appeared in Elkhorn Slough in 1984. Through the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Monterey Bay Aquarium's sea otter surrogacy program rehabilitated stranded pups and released them along the central California coast, surrogate-raised animals, and their wild-born offspring, accounting for roughly 55% of the Slough's growing population. By 2002, approximately 20 otters were using the Slough regularly. By 2015, that number had climbed to nearly 150. And as those numbers rose, something on the estuary floor, something no restoration crew had budgeted for, began to shift. Ecologist Brent Hughes, then a doctoral researcher at the University of California, Santa Cruz, arrived at Elkhorn Slough during this period to study eelgrass decline along the central California coast. Every other estuary he examined was contracting. Elkhorn Slough was defying the trend. Its eelgrass meadows were quietly expanding despite nutrient levels that should have killed them outright. Hughes obtained a 15-year citizen science dataset tracking sea otter abundance in the Slough, overlaid it against long-term eelgrass monitoring records, and found a correlation so tight it prompted him to redesign his entire research program. He ran field experiments caging crab populations in some eelgrass plots while leaving others fully open to otter predation. He ran parallel mesocosm trials in laboratory tanks that replicated the Slough's food web from top to bottom. Every approach, field and laboratory alike, converged on the same mechanism, operating through a chain of connections nobody had previously mapped in an estuarine system. The chain worked like this. Southern sea otters, Enhydra lutris nereis, entered the Slough and consumed cancer crabs in volumes that reflected their extraordinary metabolic demand, eating up to 25% of their body weight each day, between 9 and 11 kilograms of prey. As crab numbers fell and surviving crabs retreated into cover, a small invertebrate called Taylor's sea hare, Philoplesia taylori, exploded in abundance and body size. Taylor's sea hare grazes almost exclusively on the epiphytic algae that had been smothering the eelgrass surface. With crabs no longer consuming them, the sea hares moved freely across the meadows, cleaning each blade. Sunlight reached the eelgrass leaf again. Photosynthesis resumed. Shoots multiplied. Rhizomes spread through the sediment and began binding it. And in the tidal creeks running alongside those meadows, where sea otters had also begun hunting the burrowing marsh crabs responsible for undermining the bank sediment, the excavation of the creek walls slowed. Marsh grass roots extended downward into newly stable ground. The banks stopped carving. The measurements that followed were recorded over years and confirmed through multiple independent methods. Hughes, joined by Brian Silliman, distinguished professor at Duke University, and an international team of researchers published findings in the journal Nature in January 2024, drawing on a decade of large-scale surveys across 13 tidal creeks and controlled field experiments at 5 sites, locations where sea otters were either present in abundance or deliberately excluded from entering. In areas where otters had fully recovered, erosion of the Elkhorn Slough salt marsh had slowed by 69% on average, measured against aerial photography stretching back to the 1930s. This deceleration occurred during precisely the period when rising sea levels, stronger tidal currents, and increased upstream water flow should have been accelerating erosion. In the most otter-dense creek sections, bank erosion had slowed by 80 to 90%. Silliman noted that engineering those banks through conventional methods, regrading, revegetating, and installing structural supports would have cost millions of dollars. The otters accomplished the same outcome in exchange for unrestricted access to crabs. Along the open coast, a parallel story was being measured at a different scale. Terry Nicholson, senior research biologist with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Sea Otter Program, led a team that digitized historical United States government kelp canopy surveys dating back to 1910 and compared them against modern aerial and satellite imagery. The study, published in PLOS Climate in January 2024, found that Central California, the only region of the state where southern sea otters had survived the fur trade, recorded a 57% increase in kelp canopy coverage across the 100-year study period. Northern California, where otters remained absent, lost 63% of its kelp over the same span. Southern California lost 52%. When the team ran a machine learning model ranking every environmental variable against kelp canopy change, sea otter population density emerged as the single strongest predictor, above sea surface temperature, above storm frequency, above every physical variable in the dataset. Separately, UC Santa Cruz professors Chris Wilmers and James Estes calculated in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment in 2012 that kelp forests in otter-populated zones absorb up to 12 times more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than zones without otters, because otter-controlled urchin populations stop grazing living kelp at the holdfast and retreat into crevices instead. The economic value of that carbon sequestration, priced at 2012 European carbon exchange rates, was estimated at between $205 million and $408 million. The recovery at Elkhorn Slough is real. The data is layered and confirmed across independent institutions. But the harder truth, the one shaping every policy conversation along the California coast right now, is that sea otters eat more than algae-grazing slugs and burrowing marsh crabs. Dave Rudy, chairman of the California Sea Urchin Commission, has watched the otter population expand southward from Monterey Bay for years, and the word he reaches for is not recovery. Commercial sea urchin landings along the California coast averaged more than $7.7 million at the dock annually between 2005 and 2008, with total wholesale value approaching $20 million. Rudy points to what happened at Pismo Beach, where Pismo clams, once abundant enough to define the town's entire identity, vanished after otters recolonized the nearshore. He points to the abalone fishery near Morro Bay and Monterey, which collapsed in the 1960s and 70s as the returning otter population moved into historically prime fishing grounds. The California Sea Urchin Commission, the California Abalone Association, the California Lobster and Trap Fishermen's Association, and the West Coast Seafood Processors Association have all filed formal objections to current federal proposals to expand otter range into Northern California and Oregon, arguing that fisheries worth tens of millions of dollars annually, and the fishing families and coastal communities whose livelihoods depend on them season by season have not been adequately weighed against projected ecological benefits that may take decades to arrive. The science complicates the picture in both directions. An analysis of more than 83,000 recorded sea otter foraging dives found that Dungeness crab, one of California's most commercially valuable fisheries, averaging $57 million annually at the dock, made up less than 2% of the otter's total diet. Fishing ports with established otter populations showed faster growth in catch success over the most recent decade than ports in otter-absent waters. Peter Raimondi of the University of California, Santa Cruz found that where otter densities are highest along the central coast, black abalone populations are paradoxically larger, because otter-maintained kelp canopy provides the abalone with more food and shelter than the urchin barrens found without them. These findings are real and documented, but they require time to materialize across a recovering coastline. A fisherman losing a season's income in Morro Bay cannot wait 15 years for a trophic cascade to improve his catch. The tension is not between knowledge and ignorance. It is between people measuring the ocean in ecological centuries and people measuring it in the length of a fishing season. Right now, from the salt marshes of Elkhorn Slough to the kelp beds off the Monterey Peninsula, the recovery the science predicted is visibly underway. Right now, from San Francisco Bay north to the Oregon border, a gap in the otter's historic range stretches across thousands of miles of urchin-grazed seafloor, collapsing seagrass meadows, and eroding creek banks with no top predator to interrupt any of it. Federal agencies are drawing feasibility maps. 2 Oregon tribal nations have written to the Interior Secretary asking for reintroduction within 5 years. Scientists are running population models showing that San Francisco Bay alone could eventually support a southern sea otter population 160% the size of the entire current range-wide count. The ocean remembers.